So while you're putting your questions in, and maybe others will come up over the course of the evening, please kind of do use the chat and we'll try and keep an eye on those questions. So before we kind of get into the focus of today's meeting, I just wanted to open with a prayer. This is a prayer that comes from Green Anglicans, which is the global Anglican community, it actually dates back to 2015, but it's very much focused on our subject today. So it felt very apt, and it comes from a Lent resource from Green Anglicans. Lord of all creation, all light and all life, teach us to listen, to learn and to pray. God, our creator, source of all power, open us to align ourselves like iron filings to your magnet. We seek to be drawn to your intent, to live in a society that responds to your beckoning, to know the surge of your life-giving energy. Grant us wisdom in our use of energy. Help us to live by the standards we follow through your guidance, not those of others. To focus our desires on you, not the fake comforts of modern living. To be satisfied by a sense of your love, not our own power or status. Help us to learn that your way is the only true way, that everything we love and are is a gift from you, and that to know you as our creator is to glimpse eternity. Illuminate our hearts and minds as we listen and learn and pray together about how we might honour you and our neighbours, near and far, with our use of your most precious resources. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So tonight we have wonderfully got the company of Matt Fulford, who I am going to pin. Here we are, Matt. Matt, tell us a bit about you and your business and where you're based.
Yes, so thank you, and it's great to join you all this evening. I really do enjoy joining groups and events like this because whilst I hope that I can share some insights and bits of knowledge and bits and pieces with you, I also end up learning an awful lot from you all in terms of your challenges and questions and insights into things. So it's really good to be here. So I have been the heating and sustainability advisor to the DAC in Gloucester for the last, I think it's now 14 years. So all of that time I've been advising churches on sustainable heating approaches. Obviously, we've seen a huge amount of change over that 14-year period. And the reason I joined the DAC, or was asked to join the DAC, was actually back in 2010. I led a project to deliver what is now recognised as probably the first net zero carbon church kind of conversion of the modern era. So we took a church and that was heated on oil, which I'll mention later as a sort of one of my illustrations. And with the explicit intention of moving that to a net zero carbon church back in 2010. And I often turn around and say, look, we did it 14 years ago, we can certainly do it now. I run my own business called Inspired Efficiency, set that up about 10 years ago. And I advise all sorts of organisations on how to reach net zero carbon and be more energy efficient. It used to be that churches and historic buildings was a little bit of a hobby and a sideline. In that, it's now about 50% of the business. So I advise and deliver energy audits for churches across the country and have probably advised well over 1,000 churches over the last 10 years or so in that time. and I sit on the I hate all this bit where it sounds like I'm bigging myself up, but I sit on the Net Zero Carbon and Building Services Committee for Church Building Council nationally, and I also advise SPAB on their casework committee on all things to do with sustainability and decarbonisation. So yeah, I'll pop up all over the place doing all sorts of different things. So yeah, that's me, yeah, hopefully I can share some of the insight and experience that I have with you this evening.
Thank you so much, Matt. That's helped just to sort of put you where in some places in our heads. So that's really helpful. Thank you. Matt, I'm going to give a bit of a health warning to people here. In that there is no such thing as a stupid question. So we want you to be able to ask questions that if you find that Matt is saying something you just do not get, he needs to know, because there's no point him talking on and not taking us with him. So we need to find our hands, our reactions, and recognize that a hand gesture, I don't know, might be a wave or something that Matt can spot and say, okay, yeah, I need just to rephrase that, and that could be the sign that he needs to kind of just rethink, or I need to rethink what I'm saying. So please don't feel afraid of if we've said something and you're going, I don't know what that is. Just let us know so we can make sure you do get to what you need to hear tonight. Matt, here's a question for you. In your sort of recent journey in decarbonisation and stuff, has anything really kind of just taken you by surprise? Something that unexpectedly has opened up that you just didn't think was ever going to happen? Or do you know what I mean? Sort of, has there been anything unexpected, or has it been a very clear, logical chronology for you?
I think that, yeah, interesting question. There's probably a couple of things, in specific regard to the church that have been quite surprising. One is the pace of change. It's often quite, I was going to say frightening. I'm going to use the word unnerving. When I look back at reports that we did probably only 4 years ago, and you think, oh, that's still fairly recent. And you open it and read it and go, oh, I'm not sure I'd say that now. And it really does spotlight that kind of that pace of change, how much things have moved on. And that's not necessarily with technology. There have been advances in products that are available and how they're presented to the market and those kind of things. But actually, it's more to around the thinking, the urgency with which the action is being taken, and the focus we've got now on the absolute reduction of carbon. Whereas if we look back 5-6 years ago, it was much more around how can we use less energy and be more energy efficient, and how we can save money on our energy bills and those kind of things. And that's still there. That hasn't gone away. But this real urgent focus on no, we've got to get our carbon emissions down to zero, and we need to do that quickly. And what a brave target to set for 2030. That was bold. I can remember seeing, many of you may have heard of Catherine Ross, who's now moved on to pastures at the British Library, but she was kind of leading the national charge on net zero, and I remember seeing her the day after the General Synod motion on 2030, and she was as white as a sheet, just with her head buzzing on how on earth are we going to deliver this. But actually now we can really see that coming forward. So
she did an amazing job of going from that day to where we are today, and left us a very good place. I think that leads us very well into what you were going to talk about. So I think you've kind of dropped a very good clue about that General Synod motion, and that kind of links into where you want to start with taking us through the talk tonight. So shall I just hand over to you now?
Yeah, shall I'll just share the screen. Let me share the screen and get that running first. And let me make sure I get the right screen up. So yes, perfect. So you should be able to see my screen there on that. Yeah, we'll sort of go through this. I might actually put some breakout sessions in a slightly different place. We'll see how it goes as we go through that. So we'll just go through that. So yeah, I'll kind of thank you for the introduction. I'll kind of introduce myself so we can do that bit. I'm just going to go through actually net zero carbon, the targets, and what that means, and just set that. And then I think, you know, just a little breakout session, because you don't want to listen to me all night, in terms of thinking how that's likely to affect your church or group of churches or whatever sort of position you're sort of hearing tonight. And I would be really interested to know what you think is preventing your church from getting to net zero. So a little bit of discussion about that. And then come back and I really want to, I've kind of pulled out case studies of about 6 churches that I want to use in terms of demonstrating solutions and examples around getting to net zero. So they've each got their own little stories to tell. So run through those 6 churches there on that, and then kind of wrap up with that sort of reflections about what it is you've learned, and I can go through a lot of the questions. And really to try and focus on what your future actions might be, having heard from that. So that's kind of really how I see it running, but who knows where we might drift off into. So that first bit is really outlining the targets, and as I alluded to, and probably most of you are all very, very well aware of, the Church of England has set itself a target to be net zero carbon by 2030, an incredibly ambitious target to set, and that is across the whole of the Church of England. So that's not just the churches, but it is the schools, the clergy housing, the diocesan offices, the cathedrals, the theological education institutes, and all aspects of that. So that is a massive, massive undertaking. I think we have something like 16,000 churches in the Church of England. So that alone, let alone all the church schools and other buildings, clergy housing, etc. In that. So we've now got 6 years left to do that in, which is a very short amount of time, but we do need to act at that speed. Honestly, do I think we're going to be perfectly net zero by 2030? Probably not, but we're going to be very, very much further along the line to getting there for setting this target. And I think we really do need to be trying to make sure that we do get as close as we possibly can. But actually, most of my life, most of my business life, certainly, actually probably half my personal life as well, is set with people that have set themselves targets to be net zero, but then don't really understand what that means, and we're sort of helping them to do that. So I thought I would just kind of put an initial slide up in terms of, well, what does this really mean? And you know, net zero. So what is it? Well, quite simply, I've decided I can sum up what you've got to do to get to net zero in a nutshell. You just need to stop burning stuff. Doesn't matter what it is, just don't burn anything, and we'll pretty much be close to net zero by doing that. So really, for most organisations, and you know, specifically in terms of the church tonight, you've got to stop burning fossil fuels, the gas, the oil, the LPG, any coal. Hopefully we're not still using any coal in churches, haven't found one yet, which we tend to use for providing heating and for hot water. So we've got to stop burning for that heating and hot water. We also need to stop burning more of our liquid fuels, so the petrol, the diesel, LPGs in our transport, in our cars. And we probably know well about the big move to electrification of vehicles in that. And that alone will pretty much get us to being net zero. But we can't just do that in isolation. We've got to make sure that we're using electricity instead of fossil fuels, so for our heating, hot water and transport. But we need to make sure we're using that electricity really efficiently. because we need to make sure we've got enough to go around. And where it's possible and practical to do so, we really need to be generating that energy on site, and particularly with electricity, that tends to be solar panels when we're looking at it on the site. When we're looking at off-site generation, it tends to be more wind and other things. So we're really seeing electricity as that real clean source of energy. And most people are quite surprised when I tell them what the stats are for how much renewable electricity or how much electricity in general over the UK comes from renewable sources. Most people think it's a very small percentage, and in fact we're getting pretty much close to 50% now coming from renewable net zero carbon sources. That's renewable energy, wind, solar, and also nuclear, which doesn't have any carbon emissions associated with it.
We've got a hand up, which means there's something which needs clarifying. So, Russ, I'm going to ask you to unmute. What's your question, quickly?
Very quickly, stop burning stuff. I thought burning hydrogen was okay.
Depends where that hydrogen comes from. And really, technically, we don't quite burn hydrogen. It kind of goes into a fuel cell, which is a slightly different process other than actual pure combustion in terms of burning. So it does mix with oxygen in a fuel cell.
I was thinking of domestic heating, to be honest.
Yeah, so
conversion from gas to
I'm going to be honest, hydrogen for use in domestic heating is pretty much never going to happen. Okay. And if you want to, there's depends how interested you are in this subject. If you want some bedtime reading, then there is the Lord's Committee on Science, which studied about a year or two ago, just over a year ago, the potential for the use of hydrogen. And yes, it can be used in certain key areas. And I think they said it's definitely got a niche role, but that's about as far as it goes. And that's in things like steel and cement manufacturing, potentially in long distance heavy goods vehicles where actually electrification is very difficult. But actually putting it into pipes and pumping it into people's homes for use there is really never going to happen. And in fact, the Advertising Standards Agency is currently taking a few boiler manufacturers to task about some of the marketing that they're putting out there around saying their boilers are hydrogen ready, because they're hydrogen ready for something that's never going to happen. So it's certainly part of the solution, but not in terms of having a different gas pushed down a pipeline into our homes or our churches or anything along those lines.
Thank you very much.
So that's really what it means. So I just really wanted to stop right early on at this stage going, that's what it means in your churches, and to suggest you just have a quick breakout now, probably just for no more than 5 minutes, just in terms of how is this likely to affect your church, and what's preventing you from not burning anything in a church? What's preventing you from achieving net zero? Because I'm really interested in hearing what you think might be the barriers to you doing that. So if it's possible, I don't know quite who I'm looking at, to sort of drop back into those breakout ones and discuss that for 5 minutes, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, you're looking.
So certainly there was a good discussion in the group that I was in around some of those barriers, and that barrier in terms of sense of urgency, and people feeling sort of bogged down by lots of things, which means that they're not taking action. And one of those things I often see sort of churches sort of stuck in is going, well, look, this is just impossible. We can't do this. We're a grade 1 listed building. It's not for us, thanks. You know, maybe for new build homes, but for us, this is just too difficult. So in some ways, I really wanted to then use this to try and bust some of that a little bit, and give a bit of hope, and a bit of positivity around that. So the first thing to say is that actually, in terms of not burning fossil fuels, I think the church is about halfway there. I think we're already 50% of the way there. And my evidence for that is actually studying all of the churches within, and I've got the examples here of 2 dioceses, which is Gloucester, no surprise, that's mine, and Hereford, which is often actually put out to be the most average diocese in the Church of England. Whether that's true or not, that's the claim they make. So we've looked at all of those churches and how they are currently heated at the moment. Within Gloucester, just under 50% of churches are already heated by electricity. In Hereford, actually 2/3 are already heated by electricity. So they're already not burning anything. They're already using electrical solutions to heat their churches. And quite frankly, most of those churches have been using that for decades. So it's really interesting when I hear from churches that are using gas and oil, going, does this work? Where have we done this before? Because this feels new and novel and slightly scary. Well, actually, half the churches in Church of England have been using it, and they've been using it for a long, long period of time. And as a DAC advisor, I'm constantly going around to these churches that are on gas and oil because their heating's broken, because they're not very warm, because they've got all these problems. I very rarely go to an electricity, a church heated by electricity, because they don't really seem to have that many problems, or if they do, they certainly don't ask for DAC advice. So it's a really interesting observation. Now, obviously, those churches which are using electricity need to procure that from 100% renewable electricity to be true net zero in there. You can then sort of see the proportions through, and it does change depending on area, about those that are on oil and those on mains gas. Interestingly, the oil, fairly common percentage across both dioceses there, sort of this sort of low 20% in there. And interesting, there's still a few unknowns knocking around. So churches which, despite our best efforts within both those dioceses, we don't actually know what heating solution they are using, which is why having accurate QI reports, filling in the energy footprint returns, and all of that sort of information is really important so that everybody can then best direct support to those churches that need it. So that's some thought. Well, actually, we're probably already halfway there from a church point of view, which is I think, really positive bit of good news that we need to share more often. And really saying that this can be done. We know that from the EFT returns that actually 7% of the churches are already net zero. So they're not only are they on electricity, they're also purchasing that electricity from a renewable source. Actually, I think that percentage in reality is much higher. I think it's over 10%, just people aren't reporting it. And as I mentioned earlier, the first church to go net zero in the modern era was done over 14 years ago. So we can do this. And the common theme of all of those buildings at the bottom there are that they are all net zero carbon buildings. So we've got a couple of Grade 1 listed churches, which both of those I know very well, and a school there as well, which is also Grade 1, which is probably traditionally what you'd expect to see. Lots of solar panels and heat pumps in the corner in there, but these ones are also net zero as well. And things are being done to support churches in doing that. You probably may well be aware that in July 22, the faculty rules were changed, and they were very much changed to support the move to net zero. So things like electric under pew heating is now a List B matter. So I know that one of those things that was like being discussed in terms of what's stopping people from doing this is the fear about the process and the amount of permissions you've got to get. And actually the faculty rules have already been changed, but where possible, lowering that burden down. So if you want to put an electric under pew heating, List B, you don't need full faculty anymore. Interestingly, also flipping that around the other way, and making that process and that requirement heavier if you want to do environmentally damaging things. So now if you want to replace your gas or oil boiler, or you want to replace your oil tank like for like, you need a full faculty. And this is really interesting because it's the first time the faculty process has not only looked at essentially visual and heritage harm that's caused, but also the extent of environmental harm that is potentially caused by applications, and is saying that where environmental harm is being caused, you need to be able to justify that through a full faculty, and it needs to be examined properly in that. So it's got a lot of bad press, and a lot of positive press as well. But that's why, and it's a very good move forward on that. So in terms of some of the answers maybe you did come up with in terms of that breakout session, what this really means for churches is the replacement of gas and oil boilers is now really very actively discouraged, and only is going to be permitted where no other options are available. It's not banned, but you've got to prove that really you can't do anything else. Forms of electric heating, and we'll come on to lots of those in the case studies I've got, are going to need to be the future, but they're already with us. 50% of churches, as I say, are already there. And the factory process under PU heating has got easier to gain permission for. So some of the challenges I think are there is firstly planning what to do before the boiler fails. A lot of churches I go to advise go, help, my boiler's broken down, what do I do? It's a bit late to ask the question of what do I do once your boiler has failed. You need to be answering that before it's failed. So I often go around slightly scaring church wardens, apologies, and going, if your boiler is over 15 years old, expect that boiler to break down within the year. I'm not saying it will, but if you expect it to do so, then you make the right plans around that. If your boiler is over 20 years old, expect it to fail next week. Now, if you go in with that mindset, that often creates some of this urgency of going, my boiler's 30 years old. Well, you're doing really well then, but it's not going to last you very much longer. It's probably going to fail next week. You might get a bit longer out of it. Who knows? But if you're expecting that, then that's what's happened. Electricity supply, I saw that on some of the questions on the chat earlier. And can we get enough capacity in our building to do that? And I think the biggest challenge actually is accepting that there's a change. We need to do something different. Just because you've got a metal box somewhere down in a basement that provides heat doesn't mean that's the right way to carry on doing it going forward. So we need to accept that change running out there. Lots of technologies out there to do this, mainly heat pumps in lots of different forms. And I'm not going to go into a technical talk now on all the different forms of heat pumps, but just to say that my wife will lay testimony to the fact that I scream at the TV when the media mention heat pump as a single entity. It's not, it's many, many different things. It's a bit like saying that all forms of transport are the same. And we know if we want to get from A to B, we can cycle, walk, get the train, the bus, fly in a helicopter, whatever. They've all got different attributes to them. It's the same with heat pumps. We have many, many different sorts, and we just need to choose the right one for the right place in there. Lots of forms of direct electric heating are also very valid in churches. And I just want to now just run through six churches and tell you a little bit about the story, what they did, why they did it, and those kind of things. So the first one I'm going to start off with is St Andrew's Church in Chedworth. A church incredibly close to my heart because it's the church in my local village here where we worship. So I do know this church incredibly well. In 2018, it had a very old oil boiler. You can just see in the corner there, if my pointer will work. And that boiler, actually the boiler was being all right. It was all the pipework coming off it that was leaking. Had to do something. So this church went ahead and installed new 3-phase electricity connection, so it did increase its electricity capacity, and put in full electric heating, and had incredibly significant improvements in the quality of the heat within that space. So it went from being a church which you knew which pew you had to sit in if you wanted to be warm, we've all experienced those churches, to being a church where you walked in and went, oh, isn't this a nice, warm, welcoming space? Quite a fundamental change. It installed under pew heaters. These are two types. Look, it's my church. I installed two types of heaters because I wanted to be able to show to people different types of heaters. Okay, so we've got one type underneath the pews, and another type up underneath the choir stalls in there. So you can see I've had to lie on the floor to take this photograph. When you walk in the church, you barely notice they're there, but you can see them in there. So that's what they've done moving forward. We've got other bits of heaters where we haven't got pews. So we've got a white panel heater slipped in behind the altar there because we do love the members of our clergy, so we want to keep them warm as they're administering communion. We've got this that photograph looks like it's been squatted down slightly. We've got this a suspended heater, this black heater there, that spins down and actually heats, radiates heat into this space here, which is sort of the choir vestry. It's also a funny area behind the organ. It allowed the oil tank to be removed, so that's where the oil tank was. You can see it in position there, not looking particularly attractive against the Grade 1 listed building, and now it's gone. It also allowed for, when we had big fan convectors that rattled and made a noise and blew some warm air in if you were lucky, they've been taken out. And in this case, we replaced it with one very slim flat panel heater. You can see the architecture better. We can get in around the font that much better, a bit more room, and it's now absolutely quiet. So there are improvements there as well. And yeah, other big radiators, big cast iron radiators have now gone. So we're bringing back the ability to see some of the other furniture and features within that building there. Various lessons learnt in there. We found that these brown pew heaters, the ones we used in the nave rather than the ones we used in the choir, provide a bit more distributed heat, so we didn't get people complaining about a line of heat on the back of their legs, which we do with the ones up in the choir. We had a little challenge around the brackets, needed to fix them, and we needed to get them a bit shorter, which now the manufacturers make. You really do need to heat the whole length of the pew. Don't leave gaps between, or large gaps between the heaters. So this hit and miss approach that some churches have gone and going, oh, I'll put one heater in those pews and I'll miss a row of pews and then put it in the next pew. That doesn't work. You need to heat the length of every pew that you want heated. With programming, really keep it simple. We put in kind of, it wasn't that complicated, but we put in programmers that you could time to turn the heaters on. We worked out you only need to turn them on 15 or 20 minutes beforehand. And the easiest way to do that is to have a switch that the church warden turns on immediately after they turn on the light switch when they arrive to prepare for the service. That works the best and it's the simplest. So that's sort of that project. I've put a slide in. I'm not going to talk through it now in terms of the costs of that, so you can see how much that costs. So if you want to refer back to these slides, then they're there. So that was St Andrew's in Chedworth. One church, went from oil, used electric under pew, huge benefits in there, cheaper to run, is great. This was St Michael's in Withington, also a church I know very well because 10 years ago I used to live in the village of Withington, and this at the time was my local parish church at which we worshipped, and both of my children were baptised. So it's everything that's sort of going against you in terms of wanting to do big projects. It's Grade 1 listed, conservation area, whereas natural beauty. It was again heated from oil into a cast iron radiators, very similar to we've seen at St Andrews. In 2010, this was a church that set out to be net zero carbon. And at the time, really interestingly, we did this, doing lots of energy efficiency things, changing the lighting for LEDs, which weren't as common back in 2010. They are now. And from a heating point of view, we put in a biomass boiler, which was quite interesting. So took out the oil boiler, put in a biomass boiler. Biomass boilers are big. We only just about managed to squeeze it into that space. And it replaced the oil boiler, and it worked fine, but it didn't improve the heating in the church whatsoever. We still had the same radiators. If you happened to be set close to one, then that was great. If you didn't, you were pretty cold. It warmed up in pretty much the same amount of time as the previous oil boiler took. It didn't really change the heating within the church. And this biomass boiler needed to have its pellets loaded into it. It was only being used for 8 hours a week, so it didn't need very many pellets. And the easiest way to do that was to get bags of pellets and load them by hand into a big hopper that sort of sits just behind that black unit there. After 10 years, interestingly, things did change at this church. But what we also did at this church was to put solar panels onto the roof. They don't penetrate, there's no fixings in there. And this was one of the first churches in the country to put solar panels on shortly after St James's Piccadilly in London. Now they're fairly commonplace, and I think we've pretty much learned how to do fixings on heritage structures with those solar panels that are in there. So I mentioned after about 10 years, things did change a little bit with this church. So the lighting worked perfectly. PV has been brilliant, pretty much maintenance free, and actually is one of the biggest income generators for the church because it benefits from the feed-in tariffs, which unfortunately are no longer with us. But the biomass boiler wasn't really a great success. There were lots of small problems that occurred, normally with getting the pellets from the hopper to the boiler through the pellet feed system. It often just got a little bit of a blockage and needs someone to go down there and wobble a hose or not tidy a bit of dust out or something. And we needed people to load this boiler by hand, and there were less and less people that were willing or physically able to do that. And as I said, nothing changed with the heating in terms of inside the church. It was still behaving in the same way it was with an oil boiler, and that had its issues. So in 2022, actually, interestingly, this church went, well, we still want to be net zero carbon, and actually have now stopped using the biomass boiler and have installed electric under pew heating under all of its pews. So it's really interesting to see the journey that church has gone on in terms of its net zero carbon journey. It got there with biomass and then went, you know what, biomass really isn't quite working for us, and now we're going to go electric under pew. And they are very happy with that there. So those are two churches that you may, have ones that are familiar and similar to. Next church is a very recent convert over to zero carbon solutions, and this is St Matthew's Church in Bristol, and they were the first church to trial what is now becoming quite well known, is the Herschel Halo heater, which is an infrared heating unit. Let me just get my pointer up. So this is a sort of a close-up of the unit. It hangs down in the church. You can see here in the wider shot below. Replaces actually some pendant light fittings. You just about see one, sort of a spidery type of pendant light fitting there. So they took those light fittings out and replaced them with these units that have got heating units that run around this rim. It's a far infrared, so there's no visible light. These pictures are actually taken when the units are on, so you can see there's nothing in terms of visible light that comes out of it. But you can see the thermal image there on the right, and you can see these units get very hot around their rim and direct that heat downwards, and you can see the heat in terms of these lighter colours, particularly the whites, of how that is heating the space in there. And these chairs were carefully positioned, and you can see the pads of those chairs going down. These heaters produce a kind of a cone of heat, and if you're sitting in that sort of cone of influence, you are feeling that heat. If you're sitting outside of that cone of influence, as this chair here is, you don't feel any heat whatsoever. So you've got to space them correctly and all the rest of it. But I studied this church for the Church of England in quite extensive technical detail, and doing lots of post-occupancy evaluations with the congregation down there, who very much appreciate this type of heating and is able to warm up big space. And you will notice that the previous two churches had fixed pews and therefore could use under pew heaters. This church has chairs, so couldn't. So it's interesting that this is a solution that is out there for churches that have removed their pews, which is obviously a big challenge to putting in under pew heating. The corner of its churchyard. It looks rather prominent in this picture, but actually it's hidden behind some screens under a tree, which probably wasn't actually the best place for it to go, but never mind. In terms of the under the tree bit, because it's a bit colder under there. So that's the air source heat pump, and it provides hot water into an underfloor heating system. The church went through a major reordering, removed all its pews. Looks lovely inside. Problem is, this system really needs to be on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, constantly providing heat into that church. This church has one service a fortnight. So we've got a massive difference between the operational mode of the heating, which is really driven by its underfloor element. Underfloor heating really does want to be on pretty much constantly, and the usage of the church. This massive mismatch between the two means that this church can't afford to run its underfloor heating with the heat pump 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. because it's only used once a fortnight. So the collection plate's only going to go around once a fortnight, etc., etc. And therefore it just completely and utterly fails to get warm. They can't turn it on for a couple of days beforehand because it's got so cold, it just fails to warm it up. The unit goes into a frost cycle, all sorts of horrible things going on with this. Sadly, this church is almost looking at the point of going, well, do I close or do I absolutely rip out the entirety of my heating system and start again? That's the choice that this is now facing in there. So it's really not a particularly happy case, but an interesting one to learn that if we get that bit wrong between how the church is used and its heating system, then it can go very, very badly wrong and affect everything, including the mission of the church, which is obviously not what we want to be doing in a negative way. And the final church I thought I'd mention is a beautiful little church, actually down in Dartmouth, St. Petrock's. And I just threw this one in there because I know you've got your sort of your different types of churches and your sort of festival and community churches, and this is really at that end of the spectrum. It's a tiny little church right out on the peninsula of the Dart River, literally sort of as it flows out of the country. And it's actually in the grounds of an English heritage castle. And this church is used massively in the summer when there are lots of visitors down there, very tourist area. It's open, got lots of events going on. But in the winter, it's hardly used at all. So this is really a seasonal church. It sort of has its season. Interestingly, the church here are going, actually, we do use it for a Book of Common Prayer evensong, I think about once a fortnight. And actually, it's really well attended. And it's also, we have a really well attended carol concert in here. They have a tiny, tiny electrical supply. Most of the lighting is done by candlelight. And actually, the biggest carbon footprint is the paraffin that they use in those candles, the refillable ones. And they have only 4 little electric panel heaters dotted in each corner. This church is never warm, but it's really popular. And in discussing that, it's like, well, it's not used very often in the winter, so we don't really need to heat it. And the times it's heated, it's quite interesting. The service style is a very traditional one. And there was a sense that actually the congregation wanted almost this, the best way I can describe it is in slightly cinematic terms, but is this sort of slightly fully immersive experience of an incredibly traditional, possibly even medieval kind of act of worship going on, where we have to wrap up warm and dress as we would have done, you know, Victorians and our forefathers way before that even. And that's part of its experience, which I found was incredibly interesting. And I said the carol concert there apparently is incredibly well attended. Everybody wraps up warm and kind of comes along with hot water bottles in the same way as people used to come along with hot coals stuck in various hand warmers and those kind of things, going sort of back to medieval times. There's all of that going on there, and it's got a popularity because of that, which I found really interesting. I think the sort of concept of having a seasonal church and churches having a different life when it's warmer and you don't need heating as to when it's cold and it does need heating is a really, really interesting one. And I found that fascinating. So I thought I'd chuck that one in there as well, because it might give you something to think about. So that was a very quick canter through 6 churches.
Matt, that's wonderful. That's yeah, amazing canter through.
And yeah, so I thought we could go into another breakout session. Are these churches using electricity because gas and oil are not readily available? I think it's probably in terms of that the churches in there of that sort of 50% of churches that are already on electric. Certainly, we tend to find that where mains gas is available, churches have tended to use that historically. So that is true. But oil tends to be available everywhere. So it's interesting, those sort of 50% of churches that use electricity are ones that decided they didn't want to put in oil heating 20, 30, 40, 100 years ago. Because yeah, they could have put in oil, they could have put in LPG, or that'd be more modern version of it. How many of those are using renewable electricity? Probably a lot more than declare that they are. It's interesting, I looked through EFT results and it says, yes, we use ecotricity. Are you on a renewable tariff? I don't know. Well, you are. And the same with Octopus and those other kind of people in there. And in terms of joint buying of renewable electricity, I could go and talk about parish buying, which that is claims to be a renewable source. I have a slight issue with it. They're using total gas and power, and they're really only buying offsets. That's a personal view. In there, I think we can do better. And there are lots of joint buying schemes out there. Interesting, Gloucester, there's a joint buying scheme using ecotricity. It's a local supplier down here in Gloucestershire. They're based in Stroud. And I know there are other ones in other places, and I think we will see more of those coming through with parish buying, actually going to some of those more green suppliers in there. Helen says we're planning to have underfloor heating with boosters in our Grade 1 listed church. I've got no problems with underfloor heating so long as you're using your church pretty much every day. I would say that there's been a lot of sort of desire almost within churches of going, oh, I want underfloor heating. I think it's going to be wonderful. It's going to be a brilliant way to heat my church. It is if your church is used for about 6 hours a day, probably at least 5 days a week. If you're not in that category of daily used church, then it doesn't really align very well to the usage of you only using your church once, twice, or 3 times a week. It causes a lot of problems. And I have to say, I've been around hundreds and hundreds of churches, some of which have underfloor heating, and it's really not uncommon for me to walk into a church which has had underfloor heating put in that isn't used on a daily basis and go, oh, worst thing we ever did. However, I go into those daily used churches and they're going, this is the best thing since sliced bread. We love it. So it really does matter how you use your church as to whether that's the right way to put heat into your church or not in there.
I think we could, so in Diocese of Lincoln, I think it's Boston Stump, St Botolph's has underfloor heating now. And it is open every day, all day, and it is a full-on massive space, and it just gives a very close, constant sort of 16-degree type experience, which makes it comfortable for everyone anyway, at any time of day and night, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And those churches, it does suit really well, I say, but others, I would say, proceed with extreme caution in there, and underfloor heating is unlikely to be able to be your sole heating source within a church. So it's interesting you're saying you've got to use boost heaters. Absolutely. If you do the maths on it all, and it's a kind of it's the ratio between the floor area and the air volume within the church. And if you look at most church architecture, you've got this huge floor volume and a limited amount of floor. It's still quite large, but it's not that big compared to the volume. And therefore, you just can't get enough heat out of the area of the floor to heat the whole of that volume of the church. There are a couple of other churches which got underfloor, which use it successfully. They tend to be very small churches with a low ceiling. It does work in those environments, but they're very rare to find. So you possibly will come across a couple of examples of those where it can work because you've got a much smaller air volume space.
So there's something about sort of the temperatures that we should be expecting to experience in church, and sort of, if you, as you said at St Petrock's, sort of, you know, if you're going into a medieval, should you expect to be living in the comfort of your own sitting room temperatures? And of course, you know, in my head, the answer is no. We've lost your video again. Oh, you're back. There we are. But there's also something about, I know several of our churches often comment that because of a certain organ, or because they've got very special roof paintings, ceiling paintings, there's minimum heat requirements for certain things. What have you learned about that?
Yeah, so there's really interesting sort of the slightly old-fashioned thought that because I've got a historic building, I need to maintain heat in it all the time to preserve the fabric. That can be true in certain circumstances. So certainly churches, for example, have got medieval wall paintings, depending on what substrate they're painted on. You do need to manage, actually, it's more of the humidity rather than the temperature, but you do need to manage that very carefully. And you may therefore need to use a heating system constantly in a very careful way to make sure you're managing that humidity. But if you haven't got any of those sort of sensitive sort of conservation needs, the vast majority of churches do not need heating. And I have said to probably hundreds of church wardens, the conversation goes something along the lines of, oh, but I need heating for my church just to keep its fabric right. And I'm going, how old's your church? Oh, it dates back to 1084. Perfect. When was heating put in? Oh, about 1884. Ah, so it survived 800 years without any form of heating then? Oh, look, and it's still standing. That's a slightly flippant version of the conversation, but that's normally how it goes. So our churches have survived for centuries without any heating, and they don't actually need it. And in the vast majority of cases I'm going to where we've got a building fabric problem, and they're going, oh, therefore I needed this heating because I got this. Actually, the building fabric problem is in some part probably caused by the heating. So things like salt effervescence built up on walls can often be that you've got heating coming on and it's drawing that moisture through the wall much quicker. In there. It can be a whole of other issues with materials and other things as well. Underside lead corrosion is often because we've got warm, moist air going up. It hits the underside of the lead and it causes corrosion up underneath there. It's not necessarily the only cause, but it's definitely one of the factors. So all sorts of bits and pieces like that are probably caused by the heating. So many conservationists, and I work closely with Toby Curtis, who many of you may know, actually we're looking at the under pew heating as really positive because it's only heating the people directly above the pews and it's not putting lots of warm, moist, buoyant air into the building, which is then bouncing off and changing the humidity of timbers and those kind of things. Interestingly, the Organ Builders Association in the UK have issued a nice little paper advising around heating of, in terms of organs. Lots of bits and pieces in that, but and it's important to read it if that is a consideration for you. But basically they're saying organs really like to be kept at about 12 degrees. Which certainly isn't this constant heating of it. And a lot of people complain that organs go out of tune. I'm not an organ specialist by any way, but I have been advised by organ advisors, you can make sure that that organ is in tune for any temperature, and you can tune it to any temperature. The problem is you tune it at one temperature and you play it at another, that's when it goes out of tune. So just make sure you tune it to whatever the temperature is going to be realistically in your church, and don't turn the heating on for 2 days before the organ tuner turns up. And then never heat the church for 2 days before we play the organ. That doesn't work.
I love that advice, Matt. Thank you. That's great. If you have a burning question that you feel Matt has not addressed and want to ask him before we wrap up for tonight, please could you find your raise hand gesture and open up your microphone when we find you. So if we go on to full screen, onto gallery mode, Chris Lynch has raised a hand. So Chris.
Hi Matt, really interesting evening, and I'd love to talk to you after this meeting at some point, if we can facilitate that. Two things for me have come out of this. One, you can put solar panels on a grade 1 listed building, is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, King's College Chapel, Cambridge, probably one of the most important grade 1 listed buildings in the country, is putting solar panels onto their building at this moment in time. And if you stand in the right place, you can see them.
Brilliant. Okay. The second one, I know for our church, small rural community, big church, doing these sort of capital projects, which they are, to invest in your heating and carbon net zero strategy, is a lot of money. Are there sources of funding that rural churches like ours can tap into? Because
Okay.
we're not aware of it if they're...
Fine. Yeah. A question I get asked almost on a daily, if not 3 times a day basis. There's kind of 2 parts to that question. One of, are you going to have to spend money on your heating system in any case? So if your boiler's about to break down, you're going to have to spend some money in any case. So actually the question that, to reframe the question, is well, it's going to cost me more than doing that. Is there any funding to help me with the difference in costs? The answer on that is there is no specific fund, I wish there was, that is going, here's the net zero carbon grant giving fund for churches. That doesn't exist. But what does exist is all those normal funding routes for churches, going from heritage lottery, depending on what schemes you've got running at the time, to local trust funds, to all those kind of normal areas of church fundraising. And in almost all of those, you will hit their criteria more because you're trying to get to net zero. I often see churches going, oh yeah, but this is going to cost me a lot and therefore I can't do it. And I'm going, it doesn't matter how much it costs you, it's how much you can fundraise. But then there's the effort into fundraising. There are some brilliant resources, and I know Sarah's just popped them up onto chat. So some fantastic webinars on fundraising and a whole load of documents and links within the National Church of England website in there. And I think we are starting to see more direct funding coming through from the National Church for very specific pieces to support in areas where that is needed.
And just on an example locally, St Wolfram's Grantham are doing solar panels on their roof. I think it's about £60,000 that they are fundraising for, and they have actually got a grant that covers most of it, 55 or 57,000. So you know, we need to talk with St Wolfram's.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've had a couple of churches which have gone, oh, this is going to be a bit of a fundraising nightmare. Deep breath, let's go for it. And they've very much articulated their project in terms of, look, we want to go to net zero. That's how they framed their whole project and described it to their community. And they've gone out to their community and they've been amazed at how many donations they've had from the community well outside the regular church attenders who are going, yeah, I'm up for supporting that. And we'll give £1,000 or 200 quid or whatever it might be. One church that managed to raise a fund within 6 weeks from the local community without going to any grant suppliers. Incredible. So it can be done.
Right, I think we've got Jean and Russell, so we'll go to Jean first.
I have a very large stone-built church that's stone-faced inside as well as outside, and I've got no ceiling. So when you go into the church, you look directly at the rafters.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way of insulating?
Okay. How often is that church used?
For services, twice a week.
Yep.
We have community events in there at least twice a month.
Okay.
We have school services and all the usual sort of things that go on.
Yep. Okay, so the reality is that actually you probably don't need to worry about insulation within that church, which is, I know, probably counterintuitive to what you're normally being told from a housing point of view and everything else. The reason being is what insulation's there to do is to try and keep heat in from one moment of it being used to the next moment of it being used. So if you've got one service on a Sunday and one service on a Wednesday, what you're saying is, well, can I put in insulation that's going to keep the heat in from Sunday and retain enough of it that it's still there on the Wednesday? And I'm afraid there's no insulation project that's ever going to do that. And actually insulation, therefore, becomes, in those style of use of church, actually very much less important. If you've got a daily use church that's got underfloor heating that's on all the time, it becomes massively important. So it's about where is it needed, and that usage of church is one of those ones where actually insulation, probably, so I say, slightly counterintuitively, is not that important.
Okay, now the heating is put on for the Sunday and the Wednesday services, and it's also put on for the community events that are now held in church. I know you say you don't necessarily need to heat that church, but being church warden during the winter, I'm in there most days, and the heating's not on, and I am working in -4 degrees, which isn't good for me, let alone the church building.
Okay, I would probably need to come and see that Pacific church. I'm very surprised the building's at -4 degrees. They normally tend to sit around 6. It depends on outside climate conditions in there, and understand what your personal usage within that church is. It's difficult to give that specific advice without seeing it and really spending a little bit more time there. But actually, the sort of questions I'd be asking, speaking a little bit more generically rather than specifically, would be actually, how do we heat you and make sure that you are comfortable in whatever position you're using that church in on a daily basis, and you're looking at trying to heat more the people and the user of that building than necessarily the air volume within inside that building. How to do that specifically in your case, I would need to go there and see, but that would be the sort of approach you'd be looking at.
Okay, thank you.
And I think Russ is our last hands up for now. And then when Russ has finished, just invite Fran and Matt from the church buildings team to, if there's any comments you want to sort of help round tonight off with. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So we're turning our church into a multi-use church to encourage use by the community. It's quite an active church. It has acts of worship. Michelle will correct me if I get this wrong. I think 3 or 4 days a week. But there are other community groups that use the church as well. And it's those other community groups who expect 18 degrees C or even 20 degrees C, rather than the medieval 15 or 14 degrees C that we've spoken about as giving ambiance to a church service. Coffee shop's very popular, 18 degrees C is a minimum. The thermal mass of the air volume is a problem. We've got a wonderful Bodleian somebody roof, so putting insulation tiles over the roof would be anathema, I think, to the DAC. But we also ditched our pews about 20 years ago, so we can't use pew heaters, and we rearranged the chairs into different configurations. So using infrared heaters to heat the people is problematic as well. So I appreciate this. Matt is not, I can see his brain trying to work a solution. That's what so if ideas, either from Matt or from Fran, who I know has been in discussion with the church wardens and Michelle as well, probably, would be very much appreciated. That's a question. Help, please.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm going to sort of take that and use it a little bit generally. So I tend to talk about there being 3 types of churches, and it's a dreadfully clumsy shorthand, but it does actually sort of work. One of is what I call the Sunday use church, and that for sort of direct electric heating under pew, overhead infrared, those kind of things, really works incredibly well. We've got the other type of church, which is our daily use church. We've talked about that. And that's where underfloor heating with air to water source heat pumps and other types of heat pumps actually do work really well. You've then got this type of church in the middle, which we say has sporadic weekday usage, which is pretty much, I think, what you're describing there. Is you've got maybe something going on most days, maybe a couple of things going on one day, maybe nothing on the next, but it's that sort of sporadic use in there. They are by far and away the most difficult type of church to heat. I'm not going to take anything away from that. Often we can go through and examine different areas of those churches. I was actually at one yesterday when we actually realised that actually the nave wasn't really being used very much at all. That was more of a Sunday use part. And actually there was a different area of the church happened to be more of their sort of north aisle area, I suppose, which was actually where their community use was going on. And we end up with different solutions going on in different places. So sometimes we need to kind of not necessarily look for a single heating solution for the whole building, but different heating solutions in different areas because of the different ways it's being used. And the what we're seeing is some of those overhead infrared, so the halo ones, can sometimes be useful in those types of circumstances, and also the air-to-air solution that I highlighted with St Andrews and the wardrobe, where we're blowing warm air into the space and we are heating that air volume, can be very useful where you've got, as you say, those community groups that are expecting and requiring higher comfort levels. That is a solution that we're seeing has often got quite good relevance into that sort of church, but it might only be an area of that church. So I know that doesn't give you any specific answers for your church, but hopefully kind of demonstrates the issues that we're grappling with, and that is the hardest area.
The key word was zone it. That's fantastic. Thank you, Matt. That's a good.
Thank you so much, Matt. We have definitely benefited from insights from you this evening. Fran, Matt, is there anything, Matt, from the church buildings, is there anything you'd like to just reflect on from tonight?
Remember that we're here as your church buildings team, and we've got connections across the diocese. So if you're thinking of doing something, we can probably put you in touch with a church who's done something similar or is a little bit further ahead than you are on that journey. Remember that we have an equivalent of Matt Fulford here called Richard Taylor, who's our heating advisor, who I think is probably one of our busiest DAC advisors. Remember that DAC advisor visits are totally free. Yeah, and in terms of funding, Matt and I spend our life trying to find little pots of money, and it's often at the minute multiple applications, small pots adding up. And don't hold your breath, but the NLHF new strategy guidance is apparently coming out at the end of the month. I will believe it when I see it. We understand that there might be some better understanding of church need. Is that fair, Matt?
That's probably fair. Yeah. If I could just add as well, if you're going for funding for heating projects, make sure your repairs are up to date. Any maintenance bits and pieces are up to date as well. Because funders look at these type of things very critically, and if you've got a leaky roof, they're not going to pay for a new heater to go underneath it, if you see what I mean. So keep on top of maintenance, all those little bits and pieces. If the church is damp because of a downpipe spilling water into the fabric, that will make that building harder to heat because of the evaporation of the damp on the inside of the building. So keep on top of those little bits and pieces, and you'll be able to heat your building far more efficiently than you would if it's a damp one. I'm sure Matt will probably agree with me on that one. So yeah, just keep on top of the little bits and pieces. And if there is a problem with the church roof or something, get that done first before you apply for funding for heating.
Thank you, both of you, Fran and Matthew, for being with us and just affirming us in what we're trying to do here, because I know that your heart is in this too, and want to find ways forward for churches. Matt Fulford, thank you so very much. You have been with us on an evening, yeah, absolutely, round of applause, absolutely. On an evening where we are right at the cusp of as a diocese of appointing our first net zero carbon officers in due course. So we are going to be interviewing on Tuesday next week. So or Monday next week. So your prayers, please, that we appoint wisely, because those people will be there for you to support you in whatever you're trying to do and be able to give you the insights that you need to help you in your next steps on your decarbonisation. So thank you again, Matt, for your time this evening. It's been joyful to have your company.
You're very welcome. Thank you.